I'll write the story now, in US English, following the premise about Wyatt, Atlas, Titan, and Bear at Fort Halston. The morning sun had not yet cleared the wheat fields around Fort Halston when Sergeant Wyatt Kohler stopped breathing in the middle of the kennel run and understood, with a cold that started at the back of his neck and dropped straight into his stomach, that something was terribly wrong. Atlas, the German shepherd he had trusted with his life on 3 deployments, the dog who had never in 10 years turned his head from a bowl, was pressed against the concrete floor, with his ears pinned flat and his ribs tight, refusing to eat. And in the next stall, Titan did the same, and in the stall after that, Bear. Before we go any further, take a second, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. Wyatt was 58 years old, a widower of 6 years, and a man who had learned long ago that dogs did not lie. Cats might sulk, horses might spook at a shadow, but a working shepherd, trained from 12 weeks old to eat when the handler said eat and drink when the handler said drink, did not push a bowl away for no reason. And 3 of them at once on the same morning, at 5 in the morning, when they should have been driving their noses to the bottom of the bowl and licking the metal clean, did not push the bowl away for no reason either. He crouched down in front of Atlas. The dog's brown eyes met his and held. It was the same look Wyatt had seen in a stone doorway in Kandahar, the same look he had seen in a broken corridor in Mosul, the same look Atlas had given him the night before the ambush at the fuel checkpoint, when he had refused to walk through a door that turned out to have a wire strung across the frame. It was the look that said, "Listen to me, because I know something you don't know." "Okay, buddy," Wyatt said very softly. "Okay, I'm listening." He ran his palms down the shepherd's sides. No swelling, no heat in the belly. He lifted a lip and checked the gums, pink and healthy. He looked in each ear, clean. He set his fingers between the ribs and counted the breaths, steady if a little quick. Nothing about the dog said sick. Everything about the dog said afraid. Wyatt moved down the row. Titan, the Belgian Malinois with the crooked left ear, was already on his feet, watching him. Bear, the big black Labrador who had spent 4 years finding explosives in cargo containers, had backed himself into the corner of his stall and was staring at his bowl like it might come alive. Wyatt reached in and lifted Bear's bowl. Bear did not blink. Bear did not move. Bear only watched the bowl leave, and then, only after the bowl was gone, let out a long, low, shivering breath. Wyatt stood in the middle of the kennel run, holding a stainless steel bowl of dry food in his left hand and staring at it like a man staring at a snake, and after a very long moment he took a slow breath, walked out of the run, closed the gate behind him, and pulled his radio off his belt. "Peters, this is Kohler. Come in." The reply was fast. Lieutenant Naomi Peters had been up since 4, walking the parade ground, checking the folding chairs, checking the podium, checking that the honor guard's rifles were stacked in the right order. Naomi Peters was 34, a captain's daughter, and the kind of officer who trusted her non-commissioned officers because her father had drilled into her from the age of 6 that a lieutenant who did not trust her sergeants was a lieutenant who ended up in a bad file drawer somewhere in the Pentagon basement. "Go ahead, Sergeant. I need you to hold the ceremony." There was a pause. Naomi had known Wyatt Kohler for 4 years. She had never once heard him ask her to hold anything. "Hold it how long?" "Until I say." Another pause. In the background, on the far end of her radio, Wyatt could hear the distant tuning of a brass band, the pull of a slide trombone, the tap of a snare drum being warmed up by a private with cold hands. "Copy," Naomi said. "Holding." Wyatt clipped the radio back on his belt and walked to the feed shed. Above him, the sky over Kansas had gone from the color of coal to the color of a bruise and was now starting to turn the pale yellow of the first hour of the day, and the ground under his boots was wet with dew and smelled like cut alfalfa. On any other morning, Wyatt would have stopped in the middle of that gravel path and let the light and the smell take a minute of his life. This morning, he did not slow down. The feed shed was a green metal building the size of a large garage, with a house block that had been broken for 2 years and a wooden door that never closed properly in humid weather. Inside were pallets of dry kibble, stacked 4 bags high, 3 brands, all of them from the same national supplier, a company called Ridgeline Provision, that had been feeding the K9 units of Fort Halston for as long as anyone in the base could remember. Wyatt stopped at the pallet that had been opened the night before. The top bag was already half empty. Below it, 3 more sealed bags waited their turn. Wyatt tore open the second bag. The plastic split easily under his knife. He pulled the bag wide and put his nose down close and inhaled. For a second he did not smell anything. Then, at the very edge of the smell of meat and grain and dust, he caught it. Sweet. A cool, chemical, cloying sweet. The kind of sweet that had no business being anywhere near an animal. The kind of sweet that lived under the hoods of cars in a jug that had a skull printed on the label. Antifreeze. Wyatt's stomach dropped so hard that for a moment he had to put his hand flat against the wall of the shed. He knew that smell from a training course at Lackland Air Force Base 12 years earlier, a course on toxic hazards, taught by a small blonde veterinarian who had passed around a bottle of ethylene glycol and made every handler in the room memorize the smell so that they would never, ever mistake it for anything else. 2 teaspoons could kill a shepherd inside a day. Half a cup could kill a Great Dane before dinner. And the cruelest part was the sweet, because dogs loved the sweet. Dogs drank the sweet. Dogs licked the sweet from the driveway and died on the porch 2 days later while their owners looked up the internet trying to figure out why the dog was drooling. Wyatt dipped a finger into the loose grease at the bottom of the bag and touched it to his tongue, and for the second time that morning, felt himself go cold. He spit. He spit again. He turned the bag over, and out of the fold at the bottom slid a thin, dark, oily streak where liquid had pooled and dried, an oil that had not come from any factory that made dog food. He walked out of the shed, called Dr. Ruth Halverson at her home on the west side of the base, and told her, in the flat voice he had used the day he called his wife's sister to say Rebecca had passed at 2 a.m, that he needed her at the kennel now. Ruth was there in 11 minutes. She was a 50-year-old veterinarian who had spent 9 years in a small animal practice in Wichita before taking the base contract, and she had the calm hands and the quick eye of a woman who had put down 8,000 animals and delivered 11,000 more. She smelled the bag once and swore quietly in a way that told Wyatt everything he needed to know. Where are the dogs? In the run. They wouldn't touch it. Any of them. She looked at him. Any of them? All 3. Ruth Halverson closed her eyes for 1 second, the way a person closes their eyes when they are counting to 10 so as not to say what they are thinking, and then she opened them and picked up her phone and called her assistant and told him to bring the field kit and the reagents and the mass sample bags. And then she called the base commander's office and told the young lieutenant who answered that the parade ground was to remain empty until further notice, and if he needed a reason, he could give the commander the number of her cell phone. By 6:30, Wyatt was standing outside the kennel with a styrofoam cup of coffee he did not want, watching a very quiet Ruth Halverson work her way through 3 bags of kibble with a small, patient rigor that was somehow more terrifying than yelling would have been. Naomi Peters was next to him, in her dress uniform, her white gloves tucked into her belt, her face still and her jaw set. "How bad?" Naomi asked. "Bad. Give me a number." Wyatt looked at her. "If they had eaten this morning," he said, "the honor guard would have been carrying 3 dogs off the parade ground in front of the base commander, 2 visiting congressmen, and the widow of a former handler who drove 7 hours from Nebraska to be here." Naomi took a slow breath. "How many bags?" "She's on the 3rd. How many are in the shed? 62. How many other bases? Wyatt paused. He had not thought that far yet. He looked over his shoulder at the row of pallets under the corrugated roof of the loading dock and did the arithmetic in his head, the arithmetic every logistics-minded man does when he has spent 26 years in a job where a shipment to your unit is only ever one leg of a shipment to 11 other units. The pallets he was looking at were the last stop on a truck route that had come out of a distribution warehouse in Sedalia, Missouri, 3 days earlier. Along the way, that truck had stopped at Fort Riley, Fort Leonard Wood, an air base in Oklahoma, a Coast Guard training station near Corpus Christi, a Marine dog school outside San Diego, and half a dozen smaller installations in between. 11, Wyatt said. Maybe 12. I need the manifest. Get it. He went. He came back 40 minutes later with a thin sheaf of paper he had pulled off the logistics clerk's desk over the loud objection of a very tired staff sergeant who did not want to answer questions at 7 in the morning. Naomi Peters read the manifest. Her face got even stiller. 12 bases, she said. Every K9 unit east of the Sierra Nevada that runs on Ridgeline product. How many dogs? She counted. 241. They stood there for a long moment, and above them the flag on the top of the parade ground pole began to lift very slowly in the morning wind, and out on the folding chairs, 3 rows deep, 44 early guests were already sitting down and looking at each other and wondering, very politely, when the ceremony was going to start. By 7:15, the base commander, Colonel Jonathan Reeves, was on his 2nd cup of coffee and his 3rd phone call, and he had already personally called the president of Ridgeline Provision, a man named Doug Sanderson, at his home in St. Louis. Doug Sanderson had listened to the colonel in silence, had said, "That's not possible," 3 times in a row, and had then said, in a voice that a person hears once a decade if they are lucky, "I'll be at the base by 2. And then he had hung up. Colonel Reeves put the phone down and looked at Wyatt, who was standing across the desk from him in fatigues that were still wet at the knees from the kennel floor. "Sergeant." "Sir." "You saved a lot of dogs this morning." "The dogs saved themselves, sir." The colonel did not smile. He nodded once. "We are postponing the ceremony 1 week. I've got my aide calling every family that drove in. I've got Naomi rescheduling the honor guard. And I've got the state police coming out here at 9 with the county health inspector and 2 federal agents who are going to want a very long conversation with you." "Yes, sir. Go get some breakfast." Wyatt walked out. He did not get breakfast. He walked back to the kennel, and Atlas was standing at the gate of his run. And when Wyatt opened the gate, Atlas stepped out and pressed the top of his head hard against Wyatt's thigh, the way he had done the day they came home from the 2nd deployment, and Wyatt sat in the driveway of his brother-in-law's house for 20 minutes without being able to make himself go inside. "Yeah," Wyatt said. "Yeah, I know. Me too." By 9, 2 agents from the Department of Agriculture and 1 from the Food and Drug Administration were in the base commander's office. By 10, a mobile lab was set up in a corner of the parking lot, and Dr. Halverson was running samples with a woman from the state veterinary office. By noon, they had confirmed what Wyatt already knew: ethylene glycol, concentration high enough to kill a healthy adult German Shepherd inside 18 hours. Concentration high enough to kill a small breed inside 4, and it was not in 1 bag, it was not in 3 bags, it was in every bag from the pallet that had come off truck number 9 of the Sedalia shipment. By 1, the state police had impounded the pallet, and the FDA had put out a hold notice on every Ridgeline shipment east of the Sierra Nevada, and Doug Sanderson was walking across the tarmac of the base airstrip in a suit that had been slept in and a face that had aged 5 years since dawn. Wyatt watched him from the far side of the parade ground. Doug Sanderson was 71 years old, a former Army supply officer who had built a family company into a national contract holder. He had 4 grandchildren, a wife who bred Cocker Spaniels for show, and a personal reputation for showing up in person when something went wrong. What Doug Sanderson did not know yet, though he would know before the day ended, was that the poisoning of pallet number 9 had not, in fact, been an accident. The first sign that it was not an accident came at 3 in the afternoon, when a young FDA inspector, a black woman named Danielle Osei, walked out of the impound tent holding a plastic bag with a small, torn piece of laminated cardboard in it. It was the size of a business card and had once been the corner of a shipping label. On it, in the pale ink of a factory printer, was a code that Ms. Odai recognized because she had spent 3 years auditing shipments from precisely this class of vendor, and she knew, with a certainty that made her stomach turn once and settle hard, that the code did not belong to a Ridgeline shipment at all. It belonged to a private distributor out of Kansas City, a company that had lost its federal contract 2 years earlier over a run of contaminated feed for a chicken processing plant. A company that, on paper, had been shut down and dissolved. A company whose owner, a man named Grady Everett, had spent the last 22 months telling anyone who would listen that Ridgeline had bought him out of his contract with a bribe and then thrown him under the bus with the federal auditors. Ms. Osei walked the piece of cardboard across the parade ground and laid it on Colonel Reeves's desk without saying a word. Colonel Reeves looked at it for a very long time, and then he picked up his phone and called the county sheriff, and then he called the FBI. Wyatt sat in the kennel with Atlas at his feet and watched the sun move across the concrete. He was still there at 4 when Naomi Peters came in with 2 mugs of coffee and sat down on the bench next to him and did not say anything for a long time. When she did speak, it was in the flat, quiet voice she used with him and only with him. They think it was deliberate. I heard. They think a man named Grady Everett paid a driver to swap a pallet. Which driver? She hesitated. That's the second thing I came to tell you. Wyatt looked at her. The driver's name is Cole Hendricks, and Wyatt, he was your gunner in Kandahar. For a second, Wyatt did not move. Then he set the coffee mug on the bench beside him, and he put both hands on his knees, and he stared at a spot on the far wall of the kennel where a bracket had been painted over 8 times by 8 different maintenance crews. Cole Hendricks, 23 years old in Kandahar, a farm kid from Lawrence, Kansas, who could take apart a machine gun blindfolded and who had once, in a firefight outside a town Wyatt could no longer pronounce, thrown his own body over Atlas when a mortar round went off in the wall behind them. Cole Hendricks had come home in 2013, had struggled with the paperwork of the VA, had gone to work driving a truck because a truck was a place where you did not have to talk to anyone all day. And now, Cole Hendricks, apparently, had picked up a pallet in Sedalia, Missouri, and had swapped it for a pallet from a discredited vendor in exchange for a sum of money that Wyatt could not yet imagine. Are they sure it was him? Naomi nodded slowly. There's dashcam footage from a truck stop in Topeka. There's a payment trail. There's a phone call between him and Grady Everett 3 nights ago. How much did they pay him? $9,000. Wyatt closed his eyes. For $9,000, Cole was going to kill 241 dogs. Naomi did not answer. There was nothing to answer. Atlas, who had been half asleep at Wyatt's feet, lifted his head and pushed his nose against Wyatt's palm. Wyatt looked down. You knew, he said quietly. Didn't you, buddy? You knew. Atlas held his eyes. That night, Cole Hendricks was picked up outside a bar in Manhattan, Kansas, sitting in the parking lot in a truck he had bought 2 days earlier with cash, drinking a beer he had not paid for. He did not resist. He gave a full statement inside 4 hours. And in the middle of that statement, when the interrogating detective asked him why, Cole Hendricks said something that traveled up the chain of command in a hurry and reached Colonel Reeves before 11 that night. Cole Hendricks said Grady Everett had told him it was not going to kill any dogs. Grady Everett had told him it would only make the dogs sick enough for the base to break the Ridgeline contract, so that Grady Everett could bid for the contract himself. Grady Everett had told him it was a business play. Grady Everett had lied, and Grady Everett, who had been sitting in his kitchen in Kansas City when the FBI knocked on his door at 10 in the evening, had told the arresting agents, before his lawyer could arrive, that he was not the man they wanted, that there was someone above him, someone with money, someone who had approached him 6 months earlier and had offered him a very large sum to help disrupt the Ridgeline contract on federal bases, and that if the FBI wanted the real story, they needed to look at a man named Marcus Delaney. Marcus Delaney owned a competitor of Ridgeline Provision. Marcus Delaney owned a shipping company, 3 warehouses, and a lobbying firm in Washington. Marcus Delaney had been trying for 4 years to break Ridgeline's grip on federal military feed contracts, and Marcus Delaney had, apparently, decided that if he could not outcompete the old company, he could outscandal it. By the next morning, 3 federal officers had opened investigations. 7 executives at Delaney's company had been served with subpoenas, and the base commander of Fort Halston had held a press conference that was carried on every network in the state of Kansas. And in the middle of all of that, Sergeant Wyatt Kohler sat on the wooden bench in the kennel and thought about the fact that his gunner, the boy who had once thrown himself over his dog, had been paid $9,000 to poison the food of 241 working dogs of the United States military. And Wyatt Kohler thought about the fact that if Atlas had eaten that morning, Wyatt would have watched his best friend of 10 years fall down on the concrete of the parade ground in front of a bandstand and die of a poison Wyatt had been trained to smell 12 years earlier at a school he barely remembered. And he thought about the fact that a dog, without knowing any of this, without understanding contracts or bribes or federal audits, had known. He drove home that night in the old Ford pickup he had owned for 11 years, and Atlas rode in the passenger seat with his chin on the armrest, and when Wyatt pulled up in front of the small brick house on the edge of town, the house he had bought with Rebecca in 1999, the house where he had watched her die of pancreatic cancer 6 years earlier, he sat in the driveway with the engine off and did not move for a long time. "You know what I'm about to say, don't you?" he said. Atlas thumped his tail once against the seat. "You saved my life this morning." Atlas thumped his tail again. Wyatt got out. He walked around to the passenger side. He opened the door. Atlas climbed down carefully. The shepherd was almost 11, and his hips were starting to hurt him. And the vet had told Wyatt 6 months earlier that Atlas would probably not see 14, and stood on the driveway looking up at the front porch, and then at Wyatt, and then at the porch again. "Come on, buddy. It's your house now." Atlas walked up the steps. Wyatt unlocked the door. Inside, the house smelled the way it always smelled, cedar and old wood, and the faint, clean lemon of the cleaning wipes Wyatt used on the countertops on Sunday nights. And there was a red plaid dog bed by the wood stove that Wyatt had bought 3 months earlier in anticipation of this exact evening. Atlas sniffed the bed. He circled it once. He lay down. Wyatt went to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator. He took out a small container of boiled chicken he had cooked the night before for exactly this purpose. He put it in a stainless steel bowl. He carried the bowl into the living room and set it down in front of the plaid bed. Atlas looked at the bowl. Atlas looked at Wyatt, and then, for the first time in 24 hours, Atlas ate. Wyatt sat on the floor next to him, in the fading light of a Kansas evening in early autumn, and put his hand on the shepherd's shoulder and watched him eat, and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say, and the two of them stayed there until it got dark. But the story of what had happened at Fort Halston was not over, and it would be a long time before it was over, because there are things that begin with a bag of dog food that end in places no one can predict. And this thing was going to end in a place that Wyatt Kohler did not yet know existed. In the days that followed, Fort Holston did not go back to normal. Fort Holston went into a strange, quiet kind of alert, the way a small town goes quiet when a scandal breaks and everyone waits to see whose name will show up in the paper next. Naomi Peters, who'd been counting the days to a promotion that had been slow in coming, was suddenly finding her office full of federal investigators asking for records that dated back 4 years. Colonel Reeves was on the phone with the Pentagon twice a day, and Dr. Ruth Halverson, who had signed off months earlier on a routine inspection of the Ridgeline shipment, was quietly asked by a very polite man from the Department of Justice to please clear her calendar for the following week. Wyatt learned about that meeting, the one with Dr. Halverson, on the third morning after the incident, when Naomi Peters came to his kitchen with a bag of pastries and a face that told him she had not slept. They think Ruth might have missed something. Wyatt paused, with the coffee pot halfway to his mug. Ruth doesn't miss things. They think 6 months ago there was a report of a mild contamination in a shipment on this base, and Ruth signed it off as animal safe. That was before Grady Everett's fingerprints were on anything. That was a different incident. Was it? Wyatt looked at her. He set the pot down. You're saying there's a pattern. I'm saying they think there might be a pattern. And I'm saying Ruth is going to need someone in her corner. And I'm saying you and I both know that Ruth was pressured 6 months ago by someone up the chain to not make a big deal out of that report. Pressured by who? Naomi looked at him. Colonel Reeves! Wyatt sat down at the kitchen table. There was a long silence. Atlas, who was lying on his side on the tile of the kitchen floor, thumped his tail once in his sleep, and then went still again. Outside, a mourning dove sat on the sill of the kitchen window and made its slow, sad 3-note call. You're telling me the Colonel knew something 6 months ago and buried it. I'm telling you the Colonel got a call 6 months ago from someone in Washington who owed a favor to somebody, and the Colonel told Ruth to sign off on a report that didn't need to be signed off. And Ruth signed it. Ruth signed it because Ruth had been on this base for 4 years and had a daughter starting college and did not want to lose a contract that paid her mortgage. Wyatt looked out the kitchen window. On the far side of his backyard, a big cottonwood was starting to turn yellow at the edges, the way cottonwoods do in the 3rd week of September in Kansas. He had planted that tree with Rebecca in the summer of 2001, when the tree was a stick tall enough to lean against a hand. Who called the Colonel? I don't know, but I know who's going to know, and I know who they're going to want to talk to. Who? You! Because 6 months ago, you were the handler who filed the original report, and 6 months ago, you were told in writing to withdraw it. Wyatt turned and looked at her. I was told to withdraw it because Dr. Halverson said the contamination was under threshold. Yes, but the person who told the Colonel that Dr. Halverson said it was under threshold was not Dr. Halverson. Wyatt frowned. Who was it? It was the man who signed the second inspection report on the same shipment. And the man who signed the second inspection report on the same shipment was your kennel master at that time, Master Sergeant Andre Bishop. Wyatt stared at her. Bishop? Bishop. Bishop retired 2 months ago. Bishop retired 2 months ago and moved to Florida. Bishop retired 2 months ago and moved to Florida and bought a boat that cost more than his pension will cover in 10 years. Naomi did not answer. She did not have to. Wyatt stood up. He walked to the window. He put his hand flat against the cool pane of glass. Outside, the morning dove flew away, and the cottonwood shivered once in a breath of cool air. Bishop was in on it, he said. Bishop was in on all of it. Bishop signed off on the earlier contaminated shipment because Marcus Delaney's people paid him to. Bishop retired the moment they had enough to move on the current shipment, because the current shipment was going to be the big one. Bishop is the reason your gunner Cole Hendricks even knew there was a job available, because Bishop is the one who reached out to Cole through a mutual friend in the trucking network. So Bishop poisoned my dogs. Bishop is the reason someone tried. Wyatt closed his eyes. 22 years of working with Andre Bishop, of drinking bad coffee with him in early morning briefings, of trading Christmas cards, of standing next to him at the funeral of a young handler who had died in a training accident in Arizona. 22 years, and Andre Bishop had, at some point, sold him and his dogs to a man whose face he had never seen. Where is Bishop now? Miami, but he's coming back next week. Voluntarily? They're bringing him in. He's going to testify. Wyatt turned. His voice, when it came out, was quieter than she had ever heard it. Is he going to walk? He's going to walk if he tells them what they want to know. And what do they want to know? Naomi took a breath. They want to know how deep this goes. They want to know who at the Pentagon has been taking money from Marcus Delaney to nudge federal contracts. They want to know why the internal investigation of the earlier contamination 6 months ago was closed inside a week. And they want to know whether the poisoning of pallet number 9 was really about breaking the Ridgeline contract, or whether it was actually about something else. About what? Naomi looked at him. About covering something up. Wyatt sat down again. He could feel a headache starting behind his left eye, the same headache that had lived behind his left eye for the 6 months of Rebecca's illness, and he had not felt it in 6 years, and he did not enjoy the return. Covering what up? Naomi took another breath. 6 months ago, when you filed the first report, you did not file it because the contamination was near threshold. You filed it because you had reason to believe the contamination was intentional. I did. And you filed it because the concentration you tested for at that time was almost identical to the concentration of ethylene glycol that showed up in pallet number 9 last week. Wyatt sat very still. 6 months ago, someone did a test run. Naomi nodded. 6 months ago, someone poisoned a much smaller shipment to see if they could get away with it. Nobody died 6 months ago because you smelled it first, and the dogs again refused it, and you flagged the pallet, and the pallet got quietly destroyed. And 6 months ago, Andre Bishop wrote up the incident as an accidental coolant leak from a leaking drum in a shipping warehouse, and Colonel Reeves signed off, and the report was filed, and the case was closed. And nobody investigated. Nobody investigated. And 6 months later, they came back to try again. They came back to try again, and this time they wanted a bigger event, because a bigger event was going to give Marcus Delaney the political cover to move on 12 federal contracts, and because a bigger event was going to end the careers of Doug Sanderson at Ridgeline and everyone who worked with him. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted a spectacle. On the day of a retirement ceremony. On the day of a retirement ceremony, with 2 visiting congressmen in the crowd, and cameras, and family members of former handlers, and 3 dogs collapsing on the reviewing stand in front of everyone. Wyatt did not speak for a long time. He looked at Atlas, who was still asleep on the tile, and he thought about the fact that on the day this had all been supposed to happen, Atlas had been 3 months short of 11 years old, and Titan had been 9, and Bear had been 8, and none of them were supposed to be running anymore, and none of them were supposed to be tracking anymore, and all 3 of them were supposed to have long, quiet, honored retirements in the homes of the men and women who loved them. They picked the ceremony, Wyatt said, because they wanted 3 dead retiring dogs on camera. Naomi did not answer. They wanted 3 dead dogs on camera for the news cycle. Naomi still did not answer. Wyatt looked at her. How much of this can we prove? Enough. Now that Bishop is going to talk. And now that we have the phone records between Delaney's people and Bishop from 6 months ago. How long until arrests? 2 weeks, maybe 3. How many people? They're guessing 11, maybe 12. Wyatt stood up. He walked to the door. Atlas, sensing motion, lifted his head, and Wyatt looked down at him. Come on, buddy. We're going for a walk. Atlas got up, a little slowly on the hips, and followed him out onto the front porch. Wyatt stood on the porch for a long minute, breathing in the cool morning air, and thinking about how strange it was that a dog's refusal to eat had in the course of 1 week unraveled a scheme that had touched 12 federal bases, 4 states, and at least 1 man in Washington whose name he did not yet know. They walked down the sidewalk, past the neighbor's mailbox, past the old sycamore at the corner, past the small park where 3 kids were kicking a soccer ball back and forth in the cold grass. Atlas walked slowly, sniffing everything, taking his time. Wyatt did not hurry him. This was Atlas's retirement now. This was Atlas's morning walk. This was the world Wyatt had promised him. But there was still the ceremony. Wyatt had not forgotten the ceremony, and neither had Naomi Peters, and neither had Colonel Reeves, and, as it happened, neither had a very tired, very determined 71-year-old man named Doug Sanderson, who had spent the last week in the base commander's guest quarters talking to federal investigators and lawyers, and once, on the phone, to a very old friend at the Pentagon. The ceremony was rescheduled for the following Saturday morning. Ridgeline Provision paid for a new set of folding chairs and a small brass band from Wichita State University. The base commander invited, for the second time, the widow of the former handler from Nebraska, and she said she would come, and she did. And 2 visiting congressmen, one of whom was going to be very embarrassed in the coming weeks when his own connection to Marcus Delaney's lobbying firm came out in a newspaper, agreed to attend, and did. But before the ceremony, there were 3 more things Wyatt Kohler had to see. The first was Master Sergeant Andre Bishop. Bishop arrived at the base on a Wednesday morning in the back of a federal marshal's car, and he was walked, in his own clothes, without cuffs, from the car to a small conference room in the administration building. He was going to testify at 10. At 9:45, he asked to speak with Sergeant Kohler. The marshal in charge, a woman named Deputy Marino, looked at Wyatt with a question. Wyatt considered for a long minute. Then he nodded. He walked in. Bishop was sitting at the head of a long table with a paper cup of water in front of him and his hands folded on the table like a man in church. He had lost weight. His face was thin. His eyes were red. Wyatt. Andre. There was a silence. I owe you an apology, Wyatt. You owe Atlas an apology. Bishop looked at his hands. I do. And I owe Titan and Bear and every other dog on that pallet, and every dog on the pallet 6 months ago. And I owe every handler on every base in the network. How much did they pay you, Andre? Bishop closed his eyes. 200,000. Wyatt did not say anything. I have a daughter, Bishop said. She's got MS. Her husband left. She's got 2 little kids. I couldn't pay for the treatments. I couldn't pay for the house. I said yes because the first time they told me it was going to make dogs a little sick, not kill them. And when it worked out and no dogs died, I told myself it was over. And then they came back this year and told me they had 1 more job. And if I helped them, they would pay off the rest of her medical bills. And I said yes. And I told myself that this time, too, no dogs would die, because you would find it, because you would smell it, because that is what you do. Wyatt stared at him. You told yourself I would find it. I told myself you would find it. I could have missed it, Andre. You wouldn't have. I could have missed it, and 3 dogs would be dead. Bishop's face was gray. I told myself you wouldn't miss it. Wyatt stood up. He put both hands on the table. He leaned forward. You bet the lives of 3 of the best dogs I have ever known on my nose. Bishop did not answer. You bet Atlas's life on my nose. Bishop did not answer. And if I had a cold that morning, Andre, if I had been up half the night with a headache, if I had eaten a lot of onions the night before, if any one of 100 stupid little things had gone wrong, I would have missed it. And Atlas would have died on the concrete of that parade ground while a brass band played, and I would have found out 3 weeks later that my kennel master had sold him for $200,000. Wyatt straightened. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob. Andre. Yes. I hope your daughter gets better. Bishop looked up at him. But I hope you go to prison for a very long time. He walked out. The second thing Wyatt Kohler had to see was a warehouse. On Thursday morning, he drove with Naomi Peters 3.5 hours east to Sedalia, Missouri. They went to a warehouse on a 2-lane road on the west edge of town, a warehouse with a green metal roof and a broken sign and a chain-link fence that had, at some point, been cut and repaired with a bad weld. Inside the warehouse, on the day the pallets had been switched, someone had moved 18 bags of Ridgeline product off a truck, replaced them with 18 bags from a set of drums that had been sitting in the back of the warehouse for 2 weeks, and put them back on the truck. 2 men had done it. One of them was Cole Hendricks. The other was a man Wyatt did not know, a man from Kansas City who was already in federal custody. Wyatt stood in the empty warehouse and looked at the pale rectangle of dust on the concrete floor where the drums had been. Naomi watched him. Are you all right, Wyatt? No. Do you want to leave? No. He walked around the rectangle of dust. He looked up at the corrugated metal roof. He looked at the boarded-over office window at the far end. He tried to imagine 2 men in the middle of the night, in the yellow light of a work lamp, opening bags of dog food and pouring in a poison and sealing the bags with a heat sealer and putting them back on the pallet. "Why here?" he said. "Because it was empty, because the previous tenant left 3 months ago, because Marcus Delaney's shell company held the lease. Marcus Delaney owns this warehouse. Marcus Delaney's shell company owns this warehouse. Yes. And he paid 2 men to come in here at night and poison 18 bags of dog food. Yes." Wyatt looked at the rectangle of dust for a very long time. "I want to meet him." Naomi turned. "Wyatt, I want to meet him before the ceremony, before the trial, before any of it. I want to meet the man who paid a stranger $9,000 to kill Atlas." Naomi took a breath. "That's not going to happen." "Why?" "Because he's already in custody. Because his lawyers won't allow it. Because it would be interfering with a federal investigation. Because it would be a stupid, stupid thing for you to do." Wyatt did not answer. They drove back to Kansas in a long silence, and when they got to the base, Naomi dropped him at the kennel and drove home, and Wyatt sat on the wooden bench and looked at Atlas and did not do anything for a very long time. The third thing Wyatt Kohler had to see was Cole Hendricks. He saw Cole on Friday morning. He drove to the county jail in a small town, 22 miles from the base, and he sat down in a visitation room across a scratched metal table from a man he had not seen in 11 years. Cole was 34 now. He was thin. He had a scar on his left cheek that Wyatt did not remember and did not ask about. His eyes were sunken and old. "Sarge." "Cole." There was a very long silence. "I didn't know it was going to kill them, Sarge. I swear to God, I didn't know." Wyatt looked at him. "You knew it was going into dog food?" "Yes." "And you knew it wasn't supposed to be there?" "Yes." "And you knew it was going to a K-9 unit?" "Yes." "And you took $9,000 anyway?" Cole did not answer. He looked at the table. Wyatt watched him. He was quiet for a long time. "Cole." "Yes." "Do you remember the night in Kandahar?" "Yes." "You threw yourself over Atlas. Yes, you saved him. Yes, and now, 11 years later, you took $9,000 to poison him. Cole started to cry silently without looking up. I don't know how to explain it, Sarge. I came home, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't work in a room with other people. The trucks were the only thing that let me be alone. I got behind, I owed money, my wife left, my mother died. And then a man I used to know said, "Do you want to make some easy money?" And I said yes without asking. And by the time I knew what I was doing, I was too far in to say no. You could have said no, Cole. I know. You could have called me, Cole. You had my number. You could have called me at any time. I would have helped you. I know. You were my gunner. I know. Wyatt stood up. He put both hands flat on the table. He leaned forward. You are going to prison for a very long time, Cole. Yes. And when you get out, if you get out, you're going to spend the rest of your life knowing that you almost killed Atlas. Yes. Wyatt looked at him for a long minute. Then slowly, he sat down again. But you didn't kill him, Cole. Because a dog knew you'd betrayed him before I did. Cole nodded, tears running down his face. When you're inside, Wyatt said, I want you to remember one thing. Yes, Sarge. You are alive today because a dog forgave both of us for what we do to each other. Cole stared at him. Both of us? You put the poison in the bag. I let a friend of mine get so lost he'd do something like that for $9,000. I saw you at the funeral in 2014 and I didn't check on you again. I let you drift. I let you disappear. And Atlas doesn't know any of that, and he wouldn't care if he did. And that is the thing about dogs, Cole. That is the thing about them. Cole nodded again and did not speak. Wyatt stood. He walked to the door. He knocked twice on the glass. The guard opened it and he walked out, and he did not look back. The ceremony was on Saturday. The morning of the ceremony, Wyatt was at the kennel by 4. He fed Atlas and Titan and Bear from bags of kibble that had been personally inspected by Dr. Ruth Halverson. 1 bag at a time, 3 days earlier. All 3 dogs ate. All 3 dogs drank. And at 5:30, Wyatt walked them out into the cool September morning to the grooming station, where Naomi Peters was already waiting with a brush. She looked at him. Are you ready? No. You want to skip the speech? I'm going to skip the speech. You're going to say something? I'm going to say one thing. She nodded. They walked together across the parade ground at 6:45, when the sun was just starting to come over the row of oaks on the far side of the field. The chairs were full. The band was tuning up. 2 congressmen were sitting in the front row. The widow from Nebraska was sitting in the second row with her son. Colonel Reeves was in his dress uniform. Doug Sanderson, 71, in a suit that had been pressed twice in the last 3 days, was sitting in the third row, and next to him were the president and vice president of Ridgeline Provision, and behind him were the 4 surviving handlers of dogs whose retirements Ridgeline had helped fund over the years. The 3 dogs walked at the sides of their handlers with the calm, steady, professional walk of dogs who had done this 1,000 times and would do it once more. Atlas was in the center, next to Wyatt. Titan was on the right, next to a young sergeant named Danny Ruiz. Bear was on the left, next to a corporal from Ohio named Jenna Vasquez. All 3 dogs sat when their handlers stopped in front of the reviewing stand. All 3 dogs held their positions when the base commander stood up and gave a short speech about service and loyalty and the meaning of a working dog to a nation at war. And then Colonel Reeves invited Sergeant Wyatt Kohler to come forward and speak. Wyatt walked up the 2 steps of the reviewing stand. He looked out at the crowd. He looked at Atlas, sitting on the grass below him, ears up, watching. He looked at the widow from Nebraska. He looked at Doug Sanderson. He looked at the 2 congressmen, one of whom would not be a congressman by Thanksgiving. He looked at Naomi Peters, standing at attention on the left flank. He set aside the printed speech he had been given. He put both hands On the wooden rail of the stand, he took a slow breath. "A week ago," he said, "this dog saved my life." The parade ground was very quiet. He saved my life the same way he saved my life in a doorway in Kandahar in 2013, and the same way he saved my life in a corridor in Mosul in 2015. He saved my life by refusing, one time in 10 years, to eat his breakfast, and by telling me, in the only way a dog can tell you anything, that something was wrong. He paused. I don't know how he knew. I don't know what he smelled. I don't know what he heard. I don't know what a dog knows that a man doesn't. But I know this. I know that if he had eaten that morning, and if the 2 dogs sitting on either side of him had eaten that morning, all 3 of them would be dead, and this ceremony would have been 3 funerals, and 241 other dogs on 11 other bases would have been at very serious risk before the end of the day. He looked at the crowd. I owe Atlas every quiet evening he has left. I owe Titan and Bear the same. I owe them the porches and the yards and the plates of scrambled eggs and the naps on the couches that they never got in 10 years of service. I owe them the right to be dogs at last, and not soldiers. He paused again. But I owe them one more thing. I owe them the truth. And the truth is that the men who tried to kill them this week are going to prison. And the truth is that the systems that let those men get close enough to try are going to be examined. And the truth is that no working dog in the United States military is going to eat food from a supply chain that has not been rebuilt from the ground up in the next year. That is a promise I have from the base commander and from the president of Ridgeline Provision and from the federal offices that have taken jurisdiction over this case. He looked down at Atlas. Atlas, Titan, Bear, on behalf of every soldier on this base, every commander who ever gave you an order, every family who ever missed a father or a sister because you did their job for them in a country 10,000 miles from home, thank you. You are done working now. You are home. The parade ground was silent for one long second, and then it was not silent because the widow from Nebraska stood up, and the 2 congressmen stood up, and Doug Sanderson stood up, and Naomi Peters stood up, and every man and woman on the field stood up, and the applause was the kind of applause that a man remembers for the rest of his life. Atlas stayed sitting. Atlas was a working dog. Atlas did not break formation for applause. But Atlas leaned very slightly, sideways, until his shoulder was pressing against Wyatt's leg. And Wyatt Kohler, who had not cried once in 6 years since the day he buried his wife, put one hand on the top of Atlas's head and closed his eyes for a moment, and then opened them and looked out at the crowd and nodded once and stepped down. The band played. The colors were presented. The 3 dogs, one at a time, were led forward and given a small, simple, hand-hammered brass medal that had been paid for by the 4 surviving handlers who had come, and each medal was hung on a leather cord and put around the dog's neck. Titan wagged his tail. Bear licked the young corporal's hand. Atlas stood at attention. The ceremony ended at 7:30. The crowd stayed for coffee and pastries on the parade ground for another hour. Doug Sanderson shook Wyatt's hand and did not let it go for a long time, and told him in a low voice that Ridgeline was going to fund a scholarship in Atlas's name for the children of retiring canine handlers, and Wyatt said thank you, and Doug Sanderson walked away. Naomi Peters found Wyatt on the edge of the parade ground 20 minutes later, standing next to Atlas, drinking a cup of coffee, watching the band pack up. "You did all right, Sergeant." "Thanks, Lieutenant. Colonel Reeves wants to see you Monday." "About what?" "About your retirement." Wyatt looked at her. "My retirement is in 11 months. Colonel Reeves wants to talk to you about that." Wyatt was quiet for a long minute. "He's going to ask me to stay. He's going to ask you to run the new K9 oversight program for the region. 6 bases, a better salary, a better office, a very long list of new dogs coming in who need someone to make sure this never happens to them." Wyatt did not answer. "You don't have to decide today, Wyatt. I know, but he wants you to think about it." Wyatt looked down at Atlas. "Buddy," he said, "what do you think?" Atlas thumped his tail against the grass. "He says he can drive to work with me twice a week." Naomi laughed. It was a real, easy, uncomplicated laugh, the first one Wyatt had heard from her in 10 days. "I think that would be good for both of you. I'll think about it." He drove Atlas home. It was almost noon. The sun was warm now, and the sky was that pale, clean, high blue that Kansas gets in the middle of September, and the wind through the truck window smelled like cut wheat and warm earth. Atlas rode with his head out the window, the way he never had on duty, and his ears blew back against his skull, and he closed his eyes and lifted his nose to the wind like a puppy. When they got home, Wyatt made himself a sandwich and made Atlas a bowl of chicken and rice, and the two of them sat in the living room and ate, and the light through the front window fell across the plaid dog bed by the wood stove, and Atlas, halfway through his bowl, stopped eating, walked across the room, put his head on Wyatt's knee, and looked up at him. "I know, buddy, I know." Atlas closed his eyes. Wyatt sat there for a long time. Weeks passed. The investigation continued. Andre Bishop testified, gave the government the names of 6 additional people, and was sentenced to 9 years in a minimum security federal facility outside Colorado. Cole Hendricks pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 11 years in a federal medium security facility, with the possibility of parole after 7. Marcus Delaney fought the charges, was convicted after a trial that lasted 6 weeks, and was sentenced to 17 years for conspiracy to distribute a toxic substance, obstruction of a federal investigation, and attempted murder. Grady Everett, who cooperated fully, received 5 years. 2 of the congressmen resigned. One of them, the one who had sat in the front row of the retirement ceremony, resigned in November, 3 days before a federal indictment named him as an unindicted co-conspirator. Doug Sanderson retired from Ridgeline Provision in December and was replaced by his oldest daughter, who spent her first 8 months in the job, personally visiting every K-9 base in the country and personally inspecting every warehouse in the supply chain. Dr. Ruth Halverson, cleared of any wrongdoing, received a formal apology from the Department of Justice for the pressure she had been under and was named 1 year later to the Federal Advisory Board on Animal Safety in Military Supply Contracts. Colonel Reeves retired at the end of the calendar year. His replacement was Colonel Elena Ortiz from the 82nd Airborne, who arrived at Fort Halston in January with a plan for the new K-9 oversight program, and who called Sergeant Wyatt Kohler into her office on her 3rd day and asked him whether he had made a decision. Wyatt had. "I'll take the job, Mom, on one condition." "What's that?" "My dog comes to work." Colonel Ortiz smiled. "Sergeant Kohler, I think we can make that work." Atlas started riding shotgun in Wyatt's truck 3 days a week, starting in February. He came into the office with Wyatt in the morning, lay on a plaid dog bed that Naomi Peters bought him for his 11th birthday, and watched the door. When new handlers came in, he greeted them. When new dogs came in for evaluation, he sniffed each one at the fence and gave Wyatt a small look that Wyatt learned to read over the following months as either an approval or a concern. He was almost never wrong. Handlers, over time, learned not to argue with him. Titan was adopted by Sergeant Ruiz's family in a small house outside Junction City, where he became the sole responsibility of Ruiz's 11-year-old daughter, Sophia, who put ribbons on him and taught him to close doors with his nose and made him a birthday cake out of ground beef and carrots in June. Bear was adopted by Corporal Vasquez and moved to a farm in central Ohio with her, where he spent the rest of his life supervising a small flock of chickens and a very old horse named Pete. Corporal Vasquez left the Army the following year and became a K-9 trainer. Bear died in his sleep at the age of 11 and a half on a rug in front of a wood stove, 3 feet from where Vasquez was reading a book. Atlas lived to be almost 13. He and Wyatt had 2.5 good years together. In the first spring, Wyatt took him to a lake in northern Minnesota and let him swim. In the second summer, they drove out to a friend's cattle ranch in Wyoming and let Atlas walk, at his slow, careful, arthritic pace, through a pasture full of yearlings who followed him around like he was their old grandfather. In the third fall, when the cottonwood outside the kitchen window turned yellow, and Wyatt had planted a second cottonwood next to the first, in honor of Rebecca, Atlas started sleeping more. The morning Atlas died, it was very cold, and there was frost on the grass. Wyatt woke up at 5 the way he had every morning of his adult life, and he walked into the living room, and Atlas was on his side on the plaid dog bed, and his breathing was very slow and his eyes were open, and when Wyatt sat down beside him and put his hand on the shepherd's ribs, Atlas looked at him, and Atlas thumped his tail once against the bed, and Atlas closed his eyes. Wyatt sat there with his hand on him for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked into the kitchen. He put on a pot of coffee. He made himself a piece of toast. He came back and sat on the floor next to the bed and drank his coffee and watched the light come up through the kitchen window. And when it was time, he wrapped Atlas in the blue blanket that had come home with him from Kandahar in 2013, and he carried him out to the backyard and buried him under the second cottonwood next to a small stone that had Rebecca's initials on it and that had, since that morning, one more line carved into it, done that afternoon by a man in town who did not charge Wyatt for the work. The line said, "Atlas, good boy, home." Later, when a young reporter from the local paper came out to write a story about the whole thing, the ceremony, the poisoning, the trials, and now the dog who had refused a bowl of food and saved 241 lives, Wyatt Kohler sat on his front porch with the reporter and drank sweet iced tea and answered every question honestly, and at the end, when the reporter asked him what he wanted people to take away from the story, Wyatt Kohler was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "A dog knows things a man doesn't. Trust him. Listen to him. If he tells you something is wrong, believe him. And if he loves you, love him back. That's the whole thing." The reporter wrote it down. Then Wyatt Kohler looked out across his yard, at the 2 cottonwoods, at the small stone under the yellow leaves, at the porch swing where a dog used to sleep in the afternoons, and he did not say anything else. He did not need to. If this story reached you the way it reached me, take a second right now and give it a like. Drop a comment about the dog in your life who has been more loyal to you than most people have, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story like this one, because there are more of them, and they are all true in the way that matters, and every one of them is worth telling.